I watched from my kitchen window as David pulled his black BMW into my driveway, the same arrogant smirk on his face that I remembered from his teenage years when he thought he'd gotten away with something. But this wasn't about sneaking out past curfew or hiding a bad report card. This was about my son systematically convincing everyone in Riverside that his 73-year-old mother was losing her mind, all so he could get his hands on the nest egg I'd spent 3 decades building as a high school principal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What David didn't know, as he strutted up my front walkway in his expensive suit, was that I'd been recording every conversation we'd had for the past 2 months. Every phone call where he spoke to me like I was a confused child. Every visit where he'd pat my hand condescendingly and suggest I was getting forgetful. Every manipulation disguised as concern for my well-being. The small digital recorder I'd purchased from Radio Shack sat innocuously on my kitchen counter, looking like nothing more than an old woman's attempt to keep up with modern technology. The sound of David's key turning in my front door lock sent a familiar chill down my spine. For 45 years, I'd welcomed that sound. First as a single mother grateful her son had made it home safely, then as a proud parent watching him build what appeared to be a successful life. Now hearing that same key felt like an invasion, a reminder that my own child viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. "Mom?" David called out, his voice carrying that particular tone he'd perfected over the past 6 months. Part concern, part impatience, entirely condescending. "It's me. I brought Becca with me to help with some things around the house." I dried my hands on the blue dish towel my late husband Frank had given me for our 25th anniversary, taking a moment to steady myself before responding. "I'm in the kitchen, dear." Just finishing up the breakfast dishes. David appeared in the doorway moments later, his wife Rebecca trailing behind him with an expression I'd learned to recognize. It was the look of someone who felt uncomfortable, but was going along with the plan anyway. Becca had always been the more sensitive of the two, which made her complicity in David's scheme particularly disappointing. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," Becca said softly, avoiding direct eye contact. "How are you feeling today?" There it was again, that loaded question. How are you feeling today? As if yesterday I'd been wandering the streets in my nightgown, or calling the police about imaginary burglars. I smiled warmly, the same smile I'd used to disarm difficult parents during parent-teacher conferences for 3 decades. "I'm feeling wonderful, sweetheart." Clear as a bell, as always. I watched David's jaw tighten slightly at my emphasis on clarity. "Coffee's fresh, if you'd like some." David settled himself at my kitchen table without invitation, spreading out a manila folder with the kind of theatrical authority I recognized from his insurance sales presentations. "Actually, Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something important. About your finances." I poured myself a cup of coffee, taking my time with the cream and sugar, while David waited with barely concealed impatience. This was his mistake, always had been, even as a child. David assumed that because I moved deliberately, because I considered my words carefully, it meant I was slow or confused. He'd never understood that patience and precision were strengths, not weaknesses. "What about my finances, David?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. The same chair where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd discussed his college plans, where I'd celebrated his wedding announcement. Now it felt like sitting across from a stranger. Becca shifted uncomfortably by the kitchen counter, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. David, however, leaned forward with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Well, Mom, Becca and I have been talking, and we're concerned about your ability to manage your money properly. You know, with your condition getting worse." "My condition." I took a slow sip of coffee, savoring both the warmth and the moment. David had been building this narrative for months. Subtle comments to neighbors about my forgetfulness. Concerned phone calls to Dr. Martinez questioning my mental state. Worried conversations with the bank about my financial decisions. All of it carefully orchestrated to create the impression that Margaret Thompson, who had balanced school budgets and managed her household finances for decades, was suddenly incapable of handling her own affairs. "I wasn't aware I had a condition, David," I said mildly. "Perhaps you could enlighten me." The flash of irritation that crossed his face was quickly replaced by a patronizing smile. Mom, we've talked about this. The forgetfulness, the confusion, the way you've been repeating yourself. Dr. Martinez mentioned it too, how you seem to be struggling with some cognitive issues. This was interesting. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been my physician for 15 years and one of my closest friends since we'd served together on the hospital board. If David was claiming she'd expressed concerns about my mental state, he was either lying outright or had somehow manipulated her as well. Given that Sarah and I had lunch every Thursday and she'd never mentioned any cognitive concerns, I suspected the former. Really? I asked, maintaining the same pleasant tone I'd used with students who were clearly lying about their missing homework. When did Dr. Martinez express these concerns? I just saw her last week for my annual checkup, and she seemed quite pleased with my overall health. David's eyes narrowed slightly, a tell I remembered from his childhood poker face. It wasn't during your regular appointment, Mom. She called me because she was worried about you. As your next of kin, she felt I should know about your declining mental state. Patient confidentiality laws would have prevented Drive Martinez from making any such call without my explicit permission. But I didn't point this out. Instead, I filed this information away for future use. David was building his case on fabrications, which meant his foundation was fundamentally weak. How thoughtful of her, I murmured. And what exactly did she tell you about my declining mental state? Becca cleared her throat softly. Maybe we should just focus on the practical matters, she suggested, shooting David a meaningful look. The financial stuff. But David was on a roll now, committed to his performance. She mentioned that you've been having trouble remembering appointments, getting confused about medications, that sort of thing. Classic early-stage dementia symptoms. I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was news to me. I see. And based on this conversation with Dr. Martinez, you've decided that I'm no longer capable of managing my own finances? It's not about what we've decided, Mom, David said, his voice taking on that patient tone people use with small children. It's about what's best for you. What's safe for you? He opened the manila folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them across my kitchen table like he was laying down a winning hand in poker. I recognized some of them immediately. Bank statements, investment portfolio summaries, insurance policies. Documents that David should not have had access to without my permission. We've been reviewing your accounts, he continued, and frankly we're concerned about some of the decisions you've been making. Large withdrawals, unusual purchases, investments that don't make sense for someone your age. This was rich, coming from David, whose own financial decisions had been questionable at best. I knew from casual conversations with Becca's mother that they were struggling with debt, that David's insurance commissions had been down for the past 2 years, that they'd remortgaged their house twice to maintain their lifestyle. But I kept this knowledge to myself, along with so many other things I'd learned through my network of friends and former colleagues in Riverside. Which withdrawals concern you, David? I asked, leaning forward to examine the bank statements he'd laid out. He pointed to several highlighted entries. This one for $15,000, this one for $8,000, and this cash withdrawal for $5,000 just last month. Mom, you're taking out large amounts of money with no clear purpose. It's exactly the kind of financial confusion that indicates cognitive decline. I examined the statements more carefully, noting that they were copies, not originals. Someone had provided these to David, which meant he either had convinced the bank to give him access to my private financial information or had somehow obtained them through other means. Either way, it represented a serious breach of my privacy. I see, I said calmly. And you don't think there might be reasonable explanations for these withdrawals? What reasonable explanation could there be for taking out thousands of dollars in cash, Mom? Where is that money now? I stood up slowly, moving to the kitchen drawer where I kept my important papers. From it, I withdrew a folder of my own, one significantly thicker than David's. I returned to the table and opened it deliberately, revealing receipts, contracts, and correspondence that told a very different story than the one David was trying to construct. Well, I said, spreading out the documents, the $15,000 withdrawal was for new windows for the house. Here's the contract with Riverside Home Improvement, here's the receipt for the deposit, and here are the before and after photos showing the completed work. The $8,000 was for the new roof repair after the storm damage in March. Here's the insurance adjuster's report, the contractor's estimate, and the final bill showing the work was completed to code. David's confident expression began to falter as I continued laying out documentation. The $5,000 cash withdrawal was for my great-niece Emma's college tuition. She needed help with her final semester at Ohio State, and her parents were struggling. I have the letter from the university confirming payment, as well as Emma's thank you card if you'd like to see it. Becca had moved closer to the table, examining the documents with obvious surprise. "These all look completely reasonable," she said quietly. I smiled at her. "They are reasonable, dear, just as all of my financial decisions have been reasonable. You see, David, the problem isn't that I'm making poor financial choices. The problem is that you've been monitoring my accounts without my permission and drawing conclusions without having all the information." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. David's face had gone from confident to confused to angry in the span of 30 seconds. He gathered up his papers with sharp, jerky movements. "This doesn't change anything, Mom," he said finally. "The fact remains that you're getting older, you're living alone, and you need help managing your affairs. We're only trying to look out for you." "Are you?" I asked mildly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to gain control of my finances by convincing people I'm mentally incompetent. That's quite different from looking out for me, wouldn't you say?" David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "I don't have to listen to these accusations. We're trying to help you, and you're being paranoid and hostile. That's another sign of cognitive decline, by the way." "Actually," I said, remaining seated and maintaining my calm tone, "questioning motives and protecting one's interests are signs of mental clarity. Paranoia would be if I believed you were trying to control my money without evidence. But I have evidence, don't I, David?" He froze halfway to the kitchen door. "What kind of evidence?" I reached over and picked up the small digital recorder from the counter, holding it up where he could see it clearly. "The kind that documents every conversation we've had over the past 2 months. Including this one." The color drained from David's face. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Becca looked between us with growing alarm, finally understanding that she'd walked into something much more serious than a concerned family discussion about an aging parent's finances. "You can't record private conversations without permission," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, in Ohio, I can record any conversation I'm a party to without informing the other participants. It's called one-party consent, and it's perfectly legal. I learned that from my friend Janet Walsh, who happens to be married to a retired police detective." I stood up and walked over to David, still holding the recorder. "Would you like to hear some of the more interesting excerpts? Perhaps the conversation where you told Becca that getting power of attorney over my finances would solve your debt problems? Or the one where you discussed which of my assets you'd sell first once you gained control?" David's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Becca had gone pale, her hand pressed to her throat. "Or," I continued, "we could listen to the recording from last week, where you called the bank pretending to be my concerned son and tried to get information about my accounts. The one where you suggested I might be developing dementia and that you were considering seeking guardianship." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock Frank had bought me for my 50th birthday. I watched David process the implications of what I'd just revealed, watched him realize that his carefully constructed plan had not just failed but had been documented every step of the way. "Mom," he said finally, his voice much smaller than before, "you don't understand. We're genuinely worried about you. The money issues, they're real concerns." "No, David," I replied firmly, "your money issues are real concerns. My finances are perfectly managed, as they have been for the past 30 years. What's real is that you've been systematically attempting to undermine my reputation and independence so you can gain access to money that isn't yours." Becca stepped forward tentatively. "Mrs. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. David meant exactly what he said, dear." I turned to face both of them. "The question now is what we're going to do about it." David straightened his shoulders, some of his earlier arrogance returning. "What can you do about it? So you have recordings. They don't prove anything illegal." We have legitimate concerns about your well-being." I smiled again, the same patient smile I'd used with countless difficult students over the years. The smile that meant I knew something they didn't, and they were about to learn what it was. "Oh, David," I said softly, "you really have no idea what I'm capable of, do you?" "You never have. You see an elderly woman living alone and assume that means weakness, confusion, vulnerability. But what you've never understood is that I didn't survive 30 years as a high school principal by being weak or confused. I survived by being prepared, by being thorough, and by being several steps ahead of people who underestimated me." I walked back to my folder and pulled out another set of documents. "These are copies of the inquiries you made to my bank, my insurance company, and my investment broker. All documented. All showing a pattern of attempted financial manipulation. Here's the letter I received from Riverside Community Bank asking me to confirm whether I'd authorized you to discuss my accounts. Here's the email from my investment advisor noting your unusual questions about my portfolio." David's face was now completely white. "Those were innocent inquiries. I was just trying to understand your financial situation so I could help you." "Were they?" I asked. "Then how do you explain this?" I pulled out a final document, one that made Becca gasp audibly when she saw it. It was a copy of a power of attorney form, partially filled out in David's handwriting, with my name forged at the bottom. "I found this in your car last week when you asked me to get your sunglasses," I said calmly. "You left it on the passenger seat. A power of attorney document that would have given you complete control over my finances, with my signature forged so poorly that any handwriting expert would identify it as fraudulent within minutes." David looked like he might be sick. "I can explain that." "Please do," I said, settling back into my chair. "I'm very interested to hear your explanation for forging my signature on a legal document." But David couldn't seem to find words. He stood there in my kitchen, the man I'd raised, the child I'd sacrificed for, the son I'd supported through college and helped with his first house down payment, and he looked like exactly what he was, someone who'd been caught in an attempt to steal from his own mother. Becca was crying now, soft tears that she tried to wipe away discreetly. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. David told me you were getting confused, that you needed help, that we were just trying to protect you." I looked at her with genuine sympathy. "I believe you, dear. David can be very convincing when he wants something. He learned that skill as a child, and he's perfected it as an adult. What are you going to do?" David asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I gathered up all the documents, both his and mine, and returned them to my folder. "That depends entirely on what you're going to do, David. Are you going to continue this charade about my mental incompetence? Are you going to keep trying to gain control of my finances? Are you going to forge any more legal documents?" He shook his head mutely. "Good," I said, "because if you do, I'll take these recordings and documents to the police, to the bank, to my attorney, and to anyone else who needs to hear them. Identity theft, attempted fraud, elder abuse. These are serious crimes, David. They carry serious consequences." I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it pointedly. "I think it's time for you to leave now, both of you. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about whatever financial troubles you're facing, when you're ready to treat me with the respect I deserve as your mother and as a competent adult, you can call me. Until then, I think we need some distance." David walked toward the door like a man in a daze, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. "Mom, No," I said firmly. "Not today, David. Today you need to go home and think very carefully about the choices you've made and the person you've become. When you're ready to take responsibility for those choices, we can talk. But not before." After they left, I stood at my kitchen window again, watching their BMW disappear down Maple Street. The morning sun was streaming through my new windows, the ones David had questioned as a sign of cognitive decline. I thought about Frank, about how proud he would have been of the way I'd handled this situation, about how he'd always said that the best way to deal with bullies was to be prepared and to stand your ground. I picked up my phone and dialed a familiar number. "Dr. Martinez?" It's Maggie Thompson. I wondered if you might have some time this afternoon to discuss an urgent matter. It seems my son has been telling people that you've expressed concerns about my mental health, and I think we need to clear that up right away. The game, as Frank used to say, was just beginning. Dr. Sarah Martinez answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the familiar warmth that had made her one of my closest friends over the past 15 years. Maggie! Perfect timing. I was just thinking about our lunch plans for Thursday. How are you feeling today? I almost laughed at the irony of her question. Actually, Sarah, that's exactly what I need to discuss with you. I've just learned that my son David has been telling people you've expressed concerns about my mental health. Specifically, that you believe I'm showing signs of dementia. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice had shifted from friendly to professionally concerned. Maggie, I have never expressed any such concerns to anyone, particularly not to David. What exactly has he been saying? I settled into my favorite armchair, the one by the living room window where Frank used to read his evening paper, and recounted the morning's conversation. Sarah listened without interruption, as I detailed David's claims about her supposed phone calls, her alleged concerns about my cognitive state, and his insistence that she'd contacted him as my next of kin about my declining mental health. This is extremely serious, Maggie, Sarah said when I finished. Not only is David fabricating conversations that never occurred, but he's claiming I've violated patient confidentiality laws. Even if I had concerns about a patient's cognitive function, which I absolutely do not regarding you, I would never contact family members without explicit written permission from the patient. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by Sarah herself added another layer of documentation to David's deception. Would you be willing to put that in writing? A formal statement that you've never expressed concerns about my mental health to David or anyone else? Absolutely. I'll draft something this afternoon and have it notarized. Maggie, I have to ask, what else has David been doing? These kinds of fabrications don't usually occur in isolation. Over the next 30 minutes, I shared everything I discovered about David's scheme. The unauthorized inquiries to my financial institutions, the forged power of attorney document, the months of subtle suggestions to neighbors and family members about my supposed forgetfulness. Sarah listened with growing alarm, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. This constitutes elder abuse, Maggie, she said finally. Financial exploitation of a senior citizen is a felony in Ohio. Have you contacted the authorities? I had been considering that question since David left my house an hour earlier. Not yet. I want to gather more evidence first, document the full scope of his activities. David has always been clever about creating plausible explanations for his behavior. I want to make sure I have an airtight case before I involve law enforcement. Sarah's medical training kicked in. What kind of evidence are you thinking of gathering? I pulled out the notebook where I'd been tracking David's activities, a habit developed from 30 years of documenting student behavior and parent interactions. I need to verify exactly what he's told other people about my supposed condition. I want to check with my bank, my insurance company, my investment advisor, to see what information he's tried to access. And I need to find out if he's made these claims to anyone else in positions of authority. Smart approach, Sarah agreed. Document everything, get written statements wherever possible. I'll start with my formal denial of his claims, but you should also consider having an independent cognitive assessment done by another physician. Not because there's any question about your mental state, but because it would provide official documentation that David's claims are false. This was an excellent suggestion. Could you recommend someone? Dr. Patricia Kim at Riverside Medical Center specializes in geriatric psychiatry and cognitive assessment. She's thorough, well-respected, and her evaluations carry significant weight in legal proceedings. I can call her office this afternoon if you'd like. After ending the call with Sarah, I spent the rest of the morning making a series of strategic phone calls. First was Janet Walsh, my neighbor and former teaching colleague, whose husband Tom had retired after 25 years with the Riverside Police Department. Janet and I had maintained a close friendship since our days working together at the high school, and I knew I could trust her discretion. Maggie, Janet said when she heard my voice, I was just going to call you. Tom mentioned something odd yesterday about David. He said David had been asking around about elder care options and guardianship procedures. Said David seemed real concerned about your well-being. My grip tightened on the phone. When was this, Janet? Last week, I think. Tom ran into David at the hardware store, and David started talking about how worried he was about you living alone, how he thought you might need supervised care soon. Tom found it strange because you seemed perfectly fine when we talked at the grocery store that same day. This was exactly the kind of information I needed. David had been spreading his narrative beyond just family members and my healthcare providers. He was building a case in the community, establishing a pattern of supposed concern that would support his eventual claim for guardianship or power of attorney. Janet, would Tom be willing to write down exactly what David said to him? I'm documenting some concerning behavior from David, and I need to understand the full scope of what he's been telling people. Of course, honey. Is everything all right? You sound worried. I chose my words carefully. David has been making some claims about my mental health that aren't accurate. I'm gathering information to address the situation properly. I'll have Tom write everything down tonight, Janet promised. And Maggie, if you need anything at all, you just call us. We've got your back. My next call was to Riverside Community Bank, where I had maintained accounts for over 20 years. I asked to speak with Linda Morrison, the branch manager who had helped me set up my retirement investment accounts 5 years earlier. Mrs. Thompson, Linda said warmly, how can I help you today? Linda, I understand that my son David has been making inquiries about my accounts. I wanted to follow up on that and ensure that my privacy hasn't been compromised. There was a pause, and Linda's tone became more formal. Mrs. Thompson, I'm glad you called. We did receive several calls from someone claiming to be your son, asking about account balances and transaction histories. We followed proper protocol and refused to provide any information without your written authorization, but the inquiries were persistent and somewhat concerning. What exactly did he want to know? Specific account balances, details about recent large withdrawals, and information about your investment portfolio. He also asked about procedures for obtaining access to accounts if a family member became mentally incapacitated. When we informed him that such access would require legal documentation of incapacity and court-appointed guardianship, he seemed very interested in the specific requirements. I felt a chill run down my spine. David hadn't just been trying to access my existing accounts. He'd been researching the legal process for taking control of them against my will. Linda, I need you to document those inquiries and place additional security measures on all my accounts. No information should be given to anyone, regardless of their claimed relationship to me, without my explicit written authorization. Already done, Mrs. Thompson. I also want you to know that if someone had succeeded in obtaining unauthorized access to your accounts, we would have been required to report it as suspected elder financial abuse. Your son's inquiries raised enough red flags that I've already documented them in our security system. This was encouraging. Financial institutions took elder abuse seriously, and Linda's documentation would provide additional evidence of David's suspicious behavior. My final call of the morning was to Elizabeth Hartwell, my investment advisor at Great Lakes Financial Services. Elizabeth had been managing my retirement portfolio for 8 years, and I trusted her judgment implicitly. Mrs. Thompson, Elizabeth said after I explained the reason for my call, I'm very concerned about what you're telling me. Your son contacted our office 3 times in the past month, claiming he was worried about your investment decisions. He suggested that you might be developing dementia, and asked if we had protocols for protecting clients who might be losing their mental capacity. What kind of protocols was he asking about? He wanted to know if family members could intervene in investment decisions if they believed a client was making poor choices due to cognitive decline. He also asked about the process for transferring account management to a family member who could serve as a financial guardian. I gripped the phone tighter. And what did you tell him? That we would need extensive legal documentation, including medical evaluations and court orders, before we would consider any such arrangement. I also told him that based on my regular interactions with you, I had no concerns about your mental acuity or decision-making ability. Your investment choices have been consistently sound and well-reasoned. Elizabeth paused before continuing. Mrs. Thompson, I should mention that your son seemed disappointed by my response. He made several comments about how families sometimes have to protect elderly relatives from themselves, even when the relatives don't understand they need protection. This was damning evidence of David's mindset. He wasn't just fabricating concerns about my mental health. He was actively trying to convince professionals that I needed protection from my own decisions, setting the stage for him to step in as my self-appointed guardian. Elizabeth, would you be willing to document those conversations in writing? I'm building a case to address David's behavior legally. Absolutely. I'll prepare a detailed summary of every interaction we've had regarding your accounts, including his inappropriate inquiries. I'll have it ready by tomorrow afternoon. After completing these calls, I sat in my kitchen reviewing the notebook where I'd been tracking David's activities. The pattern was clear and systematic. He'd been laying groundwork for months, carefully constructing a narrative that would justify his eventual takeover of my finances. He'd approached my doctor, my bank, my investment advisor, and community members, all with the same story about my declining mental state and his growing concern for my well-being. What impressed me most about his approach was its sophistication. David wasn't just grabbing for money. He was building a legal and social framework that would make his actions appear justified and even necessary. If I hadn't discovered his activities and started documenting them, he might have succeeded in convincing enough people that I was mentally incompetent to actually obtain guardianship. Around noon, my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see a young woman holding a clipboard and wearing the blue polo shirt of Riverside Home Health Services. I opened the door cautiously. Mrs. Thompson? The woman asked with a bright smile. I'm Amy Chen from Riverside Home Health. Your son David arranged for me to come by and assess your needs for in-home care services. I stared at her for a moment, processing this new development. I'm sorry, but I didn't request any assessment, and I don't need home health services. Amy's smile faltered slightly. Oh, your son said you'd been having some memory issues lately, and that the family was concerned about your safety living alone. He specifically requested an evaluation for personal care assistance and medication management, another piece of David's puzzle. He wasn't just trying to control my finances. He was building a case for my general incapacity that would require supervised care. The home health assessment would provide documentation that could be used to support claims about my inability to live independently. I appreciate your time, Amy, but there's been a misunderstanding. I don't require any home health services, and my son had no authority to arrange this assessment. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Amy looked confused and somewhat embarrassed. Mrs. Thompson, are you sure? Your son seemed very concerned. He mentioned that you might not remember agreeing to the assessment, and that you might be resistant to accepting help even though you need it. The sophistication of David's manipulation was breathtaking. He'd prepared Amy for exactly this response, framing my refusal as evidence of the very cognitive decline he was claiming existed. Amy, I said firmly but kindly, I am completely mentally competent, I live independently without any assistance, and I manage all my own affairs successfully. My son's concerns are unfounded, and he had no right to arrange services I don't need and didn't request. If Riverside Home Health Services provides assessments based solely on family member requests without client consent, that's a serious problem. Amy's professional demeanor shifted as she realized she'd walked into a complex family situation. Mrs. Thompson, I apologize. We do require client consent for all services, but your son indicated that you had agreed to the assessment. I'll need to report this back to my supervisor. Please do. And Amy, I'd appreciate it if you could document exactly what my son told your agency about my supposed need for services. I have reason to believe he's been making false statements about my mental health to multiple organizations. After Amy left, I called Riverside Home Health Services directly and spoke with the supervisor, explaining that no assessment had been authorized and that any future requests from David should be rejected unless I personally contacted them in writing. The supervisor was apologetic and assured me that David's request would be flagged in their system. I spent the afternoon researching elder abuse laws in Ohio, using the computer skills I developed during my final years as principal when the school system went digital. What I learned was both encouraging and sobering. Ohio had strong legal protections for senior citizens, with serious criminal penalties for financial exploitation and abuse. However, the legal system also recognized that family members sometimes needed to intervene when elderly relatives truly were losing their capacity to make sound decisions. David's strategy was insidious because it followed the legitimate pathways that concerned family members would use to protect a genuinely incapacitated parent. By spreading his concerns widely and consistently, by involving multiple institutions and professionals, by creating a paper trail of supposed incidents and declining capacity, he was building exactly the kind of case that courts would take seriously. The key to defeating his scheme would be to demonstrate not just that his claims were false, but that they were deliberately false. I needed to prove that David knew I was mentally competent and was fabricating evidence to the contrary for his own financial benefit. Around 4 o'clock, Dr. Martinez called with an update. "Maggie, I've drafted the statement you requested, and I've also spoken with Dr. Kim about scheduling a cognitive assessment. She can see you tomorrow afternoon if that works for you." "That's perfect, Sarah. What kind of assessment will she conduct?" "Comprehensive cognitive evaluation, including memory tests, problem-solving exercises, mental status examination, and review of your medical history. It typically takes about 2 hours and results in a detailed written report." Dr. Kim said that given the circumstances you described, she'll make sure the report is thorough enough to serve as legal documentation if necessary. That evening, I called my great-niece Emma at Ohio State University. Emma was David's daughter Lisa's cousin on her mother's side, and I had maintained a close relationship with her throughout her college years. Emma was studying psychology and had always been perceptive about family dynamics. "Aunt Maggie," Emma said when she heard my voice, "I was just thinking about you. I got the thank you card you sent for the tuition help. You saved my entire semester." "I'm glad I could help, sweetheart. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has anyone in the family mentioned concerns about my mental health recently?" There was a pause. "That's a weird question, Aunt Maggie. Why do you ask?" "Someone has been telling people that I'm developing dementia, and I'm trying to understand how widely that story has spread." "Oh, wow," Emma said slowly. "Actually, yeah. Lisa mentioned something about that a few weeks ago. She said Uncle David was worried about you, that he thought you were getting forgetful and confused. She seemed really upset about it." Lisa was David's 19-year-old daughter, my granddaughter, and one of the brightest young people I knew. If David was involving his own daughter in his scheme, it meant he was confident enough in his narrative to risk family relationships. "Did Lisa say anything specific about what David told her?" "She said he was thinking about moving you into some kind of assisted living place because you weren't safe living alone anymore. She was worried because she loves spending time at your house during school breaks, and she didn't want you to have to leave it." My heart ached for Lisa, who was being deceived by her own father and made to worry unnecessarily about my well-being. "Emma, I want you to know that there's nothing wrong with my mental health. I'm as sharp as I've ever been. Someone has been spreading false information about me, and I'm working to correct it." "I kind of wondered about that," Emma admitted. "When Lisa told me about Uncle David's concerns, it didn't match up with our phone conversations at all. You've always been super clear and organized when we talk. This gave me an idea. Emma, would you be willing to help me with something? I need to document that my mental state is normal and has been consistent over time. Would you be comfortable writing a statement about our recent conversations and your observations of my mental clarity?" "Absolutely, Aunt Maggie. I actually keep a journal, and I wrote about our conversation last month when you helped me figure out my class schedule for next semester. You gave me really detailed advice about balancing my course load with my work-study job. I could use that as reference." Emma's willingness to help reminded me that I wasn't fighting this battle alone. David might have been systematically trying to undermine my reputation, but I had relationships and documentation that would support the truth. As night fell, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing everything I'd learned during this first day of active investigation. David's scheme was more extensive than I'd initially realized, involving multiple institutions and family members. But it was also more vulnerable than he probably understood, because it was built on lies that could be systematically disproven. I opened my laptop and began typing a comprehensive timeline of David's activities, including dates, witnesses, and documentation for each incident. This would form the foundation of my case, whether I ultimately decided to pursue legal action or simply needed to defend myself against his claims. The document I created that night would grow significantly over the coming days, but even in its initial form, it painted a clear picture of a calculated campaign to undermine my independence and gain control of my assets. David had underestimated his mother's intelligence, resourcefulness, and network of relationships. Tomorrow I would begin the process of proving just how wrong he had been. The appointment with Dr. Patricia Kim went better than I could have hoped. Her office at Riverside Medical Center was modern and comfortable, designed to put patients at ease during what could be a stressful evaluation process. Dr. Kim herself was a petite woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach that reminded me of the best teachers I'd worked with over the years. "Mrs. Thompson," she said as we settled into her consultation room, "Dr. Martinez has briefed me on your situation. Before we begin the formal assessment, I want you to understand that this evaluation will be completely objective. I'm not here to prove or disprove anyone's claims about your mental state. I'm here to provide an accurate assessment of your cognitive function." I appreciated her directness. "I understand, Dr. Kim. I'm confident in the results because I know there's nothing wrong with my mind. What I need is official documentation that confirms what I already know." The assessment took nearly 3 hours and was far more comprehensive than I'd expected. Dr. Kim tested my memory with word lists and story recall exercises, evaluated my problem-solving abilities with puzzles and logic questions, assessed my attention and concentration with various tasks, and conducted a detailed interview about my daily activities and life management skills. One section particularly relevant to my situation involved financial reasoning. Dr. Kim presented me with complex scenarios involving budgeting, investment decisions, and financial planning. She asked me to explain my reasoning for various choices and to identify potential risks or benefits in different situations. Having managed school budgets and my personal finances for decades, I found these questions straightforward, but I could see how someone with genuine cognitive impairment might struggle. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Kim said as we completed the final section, "I want to be clear about something. In 30 years of conducting these evaluations, I've rarely seen someone perform as well across all cognitive domains as you have today. Your memory, reasoning, attention, and executive functioning are all well within normal ranges for someone of any age, let alone someone in their 70s. Relief flooded through me, even though I'd expected this result. Will that be reflected in your written report?" "Absolutely. In fact, given the circumstances Dr. Martinez described, I'm going to be very specific about your cognitive strengths. Your performance on complex financial reasoning tasks was particularly impressive. Anyone reading this report will understand that you are fully capable of managing your own affairs." As I left Dr. Kim's office, I felt armed with exactly the kind of professional validation I needed to counter David's claims. But I also realized that getting the assessment was only the beginning. I needed to start positioning myself strategically for whatever David's next move might be. My first stop was the law office of Rodriguez and Associates, where I'd made an appointment to consult with Michael Rodriguez, an attorney specializing in elder law. Michael had been recommended by Dr. Martinez, who'd mentioned that he had extensive experience with financial exploitation cases. Michael's office was located in a restored Victorian mansion downtown, its rich wood paneling and traditional furnishings projecting an atmosphere of stability and trustworthiness. Michael himself was probably in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a gentle manner that would appeal to elderly clients who might be confused or frightened by legal proceedings. "Mrs. Thompson," he said after reviewing the documentation I'd brought, "this is one of the most systematic attempts at financial exploitation I've seen. Your son has essentially been conducting a months-long campaign to establish grounds for guardianship proceedings." I settled back in the leather chair across from his desk. What would have happened if I hadn't discovered what he was doing? Michael's expression was grave. If David had continued building his case unopposed, he could have eventually petitioned the court for guardianship on grounds of your alleged mental incapacity. With statements from multiple sources about your supposed cognitive decline, forged documents suggesting you'd given him authority, and evidence of what he would claim were poor financial decisions, he might have succeeded. The implications were chilling, and if he'd been granted guardianship? Complete control over your finances, your living situation, your medical decisions, essentially your entire life. As your court-appointed guardian, David would have had the legal authority to sell your house, move your assets, and place you in whatever care facility he deemed appropriate. You would have had very limited recourse. I felt a chill run down my spine. David's scheme wasn't just about stealing money, it was about stealing my entire independence and autonomy. What's our strongest defense against this? Michael reviewed my documentation again. The fact that you discovered his activities early and started documenting everything. The recordings you've made of his false claims. The statements from professionals confirming he lied about their supposed concerns. The forged power of attorney document. And now Dr. Kim's cognitive assessment. Together, these create a powerful case that David has been deliberately fabricating evidence of your incapacity. He leaned forward, his tone becoming more serious. But Mrs. Thompson, I need to warn you about something. When David realizes that his current approach isn't working, he may escalate his efforts. People engaged in this kind of systematic deception often become desperate when they're cornered. This was something I'd been considering. What kind of escalation should I expect? He might try to have you involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation, claiming you're delusional or paranoid. He could file emergency petitions claiming you're in immediate danger. He might even stage incidents to make it appear that you're genuinely confused or incompetent. I absorbed this information, already thinking about how to protect myself against such tactics. What can I do to prevent that? Document everything. Maintain regular contact with trusted professionals who can attest to your competence, and consider taking some proactive legal steps. We could file a restraining order preventing David from interfering with your financial affairs. We could also prepare a comprehensive mental health evaluation and have it on file with the court, so if he does try to claim you're incompetent, we have immediate professional contradiction. Michael walked me through the process of obtaining a restraining order and discussed other protective measures I could take. By the time I left his office, I had a clear strategy for defending myself legally and a better understanding of the serious nature of David's actions. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call from Lisa, David's daughter. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been crying. "Grandma Maggie," she said, "I need to talk to you about something, but I don't want Dad to know I called." My heart went out to her. Lisa was caught in the middle of a situation she didn't fully understand, worried about a grandmother who wasn't actually sick, and trying to navigate her father's deception. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Dad has been saying really concerning things about you lately. He told Mom and me that you're getting really confused, that you might need to go into a nursing home soon. But when I talked to Emma, she said you seemed completely normal when you helped her with her college stuff." I chose my words carefully. Lisa was David's daughter, and I didn't want to put her in an impossible position between her father and her grandmother. "Lisa, what exactly has your father told you about my health?" He said, "Doctor," but Maggie, the caller, mentioned specific things. They said someone reported that you'd been seen wandering around confused, that your house was in disrepair, that you hadn't been taking care of yourself properly. David was escalating exactly as Michael Rodriguez had predicted. Having failed to gain control through financial institutions and healthcare providers, he was now involving government agencies designed to protect vulnerable adults. Did the caller say who made the report? They said reports are confidential, but they're required to investigate all claims of elder abuse or neglect. They want to schedule a home visit to assess your living situation. I felt a surge of anger at David's latest manipulation, but I also recognized an opportunity. An official investigation would actually work in my favor if I was prepared for it properly. "Janet, did they give Tom any information about when this visit might happen?" "Sometime this week. They said they'd call you directly to schedule it." I thanked Janet and immediately called Michael Rodriguez to inform him of this development. His response was swift and strategic. "This is actually good news, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "Adult Protective Services investigations are thorough and objective. When they visit your home and interview you, they'll quickly determine that the report was false. Their findings will become part of the official record, providing additional evidence that someone has been making fabricated claims about your well-being. Should I prepare for the visit in any particular way?" Just be yourself. Make sure your house is tidy, have your medications organized and properly labeled, keep some recent bills and financial statements available to show you're managing your affairs competently. The investigator will be looking for signs of genuine neglect or confusion, and they'll find none. Michael paused before continuing. Mrs. Thompson, I think it's time we took more aggressive action. David's willingness to involve APS shows he's not going to stop these false reports voluntarily. I'd like to schedule a meeting with the district attorney's office to discuss filing criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. This was a significant escalation, but David's actions had made it necessary. What kind of charges would we be looking at? Financial exploitation of an elderly person? Identity theft for the forged power of attorney? Potentially harassment for the pattern of false reports to various agencies? These are serious felonies in Ohio, with substantial prison sentences if he's convicted. I considered this carefully. Taking criminal action against my own son felt like crossing a line I'd never imagined crossing. But David's behavior had already crossed lines I'd never imagined he would cross. Let me think about it over the weekend, I said. If David makes any more false reports or tries any other manipulative tactics, I'll be ready to move forward with criminal charges. The APS visit came on Thursday afternoon. The investigator, Maria Santos, was a professional woman in her 30s who clearly had extensive experience with these kinds of assessments. She spent 2 hours at my house, reviewing my living conditions, examining my medications, discussing my daily routines, and conducting a mental status evaluation. Mrs. Thompson, Maria said as she completed her paperwork, I want you to know that whoever reported concerns about your welfare was either seriously misinformed or deliberately providing false information. Your home is immaculate, you're clearly managing all your affairs competently, and your mental state is excellent. Will that be reflected in your official report? Absolutely. I'll be recommending that this case be closed immediately, with no services needed. I'll also be noting that the initial report appears to have been made in bad faith, possibly as part of a family dispute or other ulterior motive. Maria's report would provide another crucial piece of documentation, proving that David's claims about my welfare were fabricated. But more importantly, it demonstrated that his escalating tactics were backfiring, creating official records that contradicted rather than supported his narrative. That evening, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. I called David directly, something I hadn't done since our confrontation in my kitchen the week before. Mom? David answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. Hello, David. I think it's time we had another conversation. I'm glad you called. Becca and I have been worried about you, especially after how upset you seemed last week. I almost admired his commitment to maintaining his facade, even in the face of mounting evidence that I was aware of his scheme. David, I'm calling to inform you that I've discovered the full extent of your activities over the past several months. There was a pause. I don't know what you mean. I know about your false reports to Adult Protective Services. I know about your attempts to arrange home health services I didn't request. I know about your lies to my financial institutions, your fabricated conversations with Dr. Martinez, and your systematic campaign to convince people that I'm mentally incompetent. The silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, dropping the concerned son act. What do you want, Mom? I want you to stop. Immediately. No more false reports. No more unauthorized inquiries about my affairs. No more lies about my mental health. If you do, we can work out whatever financial problems you're having through honest conversation. And if I don't stop? I took a deep breath before delivering the ultimatum I'd been preparing for. Then tomorrow morning, I'll be meeting with the district attorney to file criminal charges for elder abuse, financial exploitation, identity theft, and fraud. I have extensive documentation of everything you've done, David. Recordings, witness statements, official reports, professional evaluations. Everything you need to destroy your life permanently. Another long pause. You wouldn't send your own son to prison. Try me, I said quietly. You've spent months trying to destroy my independence and steal my life savings by convincing people I'm mentally incompetent. You've traumatized your own daughter with lies about my health. You've violated my privacy, forged my signature, and made false reports to government agencies. What kind of mother would I be if I allowed that to continue? Mom, you don't understand the pressure I'm under, the financial problems, the debts, the way Becca looks at me when I can't provide for our family the way I should. For a moment, I heard the frightened boy David had once been, the child who'd tried so hard to make me proud after his father left us. But that sympathy was quickly replaced by anger at what he'd chosen to become. David, if you had come to me honestly about financial problems, I would have helped you. I've always helped you. But instead, you chose to try to steal from me by destroying my reputation and independence. That's unforgivable. What do you want me to do? I want you to call every person and institution you've lied to and retract your statements. I want written apologies to Dr. Martinez, my bank, my investment advisor, Adult Protective Services, and anyone else you've involved in your scheme. I want you to explain to Lisa that you've been lying about my health and apologize for putting her through that trauma. And then what? Then we'll see if there's any way to rebuild a relationship based on honesty instead of manipulation. But David, understand this clearly. If you make even one more false claim about my mental health, if you contact any institution about my affairs without my permission, if you involve Lisa or anyone else in your lies, I will have you arrested without hesitation. I hung up before he could respond, leaving him to contemplate the choice between acknowledging his deception or facing criminal prosecution. Either way, his campaign to control my life was over. The weekend passed quietly, giving me time to reflect on the dramatic changes in my relationship with my son. By Sunday evening, I had received written retractions and apologies from David to Dr. Martinez, Riverside Community Bank, Great Lakes Financial Services, and Adult Protective Services. Each letter acknowledged that his previous statements about my mental health had been inaccurate and apologized for any confusion his reports might have caused. Lisa called Sunday night, tearful but relieved, to tell me that David had admitted he'd been wrong about my health and that she didn't need to worry about me going into a nursing home. She didn't ask why her father had lied, and I didn't volunteer an explanation. Some conversations would have to wait until she was older and better equipped to understand the complexity of family betrayal. Monday morning brought a call from Michael Rodriguez with news that would reshape the entire situation once again. Mrs. Thompson, he said, I've received some interesting information from my contacts in the Financial Crimes Division. It seems your son's insurance business is under investigation for fraudulent sales practices. Apparently, several elderly clients have filed complaints about policies they claim they never agreed to purchase. This information casts David's behavior toward me in an entirely new light. His financial problems weren't just personal debt. They were the result of potentially criminal business practices that could result in serious legal consequences, regardless of what happened with his scheme against me. What does this mean for our situation? I asked. It means David has much bigger problems than your potential criminal charges. If the insurance investigation leads to fraud convictions, he'll be facing significant prison time and financial ruin. Your willingness to prosecute him for elder abuse becomes a much smaller concern when he's already looking at major criminal liability. As I hung up the phone, I realized that David's desperation to access my money now made perfect sense. He wasn't just dealing with lifestyle debt. He was facing the complete collapse of his career and potentially his freedom. My savings weren't just an opportunity for him. They might have seemed like his only chance at survival. Understanding his motivation didn't excuse his actions, but it did explain the systematic and calculated nature of his approach. David hadn't been simply greedy. He'd been genuinely desperate, which made him both more dangerous and more vulnerable. The game was changing again, and I needed to be prepared for whatever move David would make next. David's response to my ultimatum came not in words, but in actions that revealed just how desperate he had become. On Tuesday morning, I discovered that someone had been in my backyard during the night, going through my garbage and apparently searching for something specific. The trash cans had been moved, their contents scattered across the lawn, and my recycling bin was completely empty despite being full when I'd put it out the evening before. Janet Walsh called shortly after I'd cleaned up the mess. "Maggie, Tom was up late last night with his insomnia, and he saw someone in your backyard around 2 in the morning. He couldn't see who it was clearly, but they had a flashlight and seemed to be going through your trash. He would have called the police, but by the time he got dressed and outside, whoever it was had already left. I thanked Janet for the information, while my mind raced through the implications. David was looking for evidence he could use against me, probably hoping to find something that would support his claims about my mental decline. Prescription bottles that might suggest cognitive medication, financial documents that could be taken out of context, anything he could present as proof of his fabricated concerns. The fact that he was willing to trespass on my property and rifle through my garbage showed just how cornered he felt. David had always been proud of his professional image, his standing in the community, his reputation as a successful insurance agent. For him to risk being caught in such desperate behavior meant his situation was even worse than I'd realized. I called Michael Rodriguez immediately to report the incident. His response was swift and decisive. "Mrs. Thompson, this constitutes criminal trespassing and potentially attempted burglary. We need to file a police report immediately and request increased patrols of your property." David's behavior is escalating in exactly the way I was concerned about. Within an hour, Officer Patricia Williams from the Riverside Police Department was at my house, taking a detailed report about the nighttime intrusion. Officer Williams was a seasoned professional who clearly had experience with family disputes that had spiraled into criminal behavior. "Mrs. Thompson," she said as she documented the scene, "have you considered installing a security system? Given the ongoing family conflict and the potential for further incidents, it might be a wise investment." I had been thinking about exactly that. "What would you recommend?" "Motion-activated cameras covering all entrances and the backyard. Good exterior lighting, maybe a monitored alarm system. The goal is both to deter future incidents and to document them if they occur." After Officer Williams left, I spent the afternoon researching security systems and had installers from Guardian Home Security scheduled for the following day. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's attempts to portray me as an incompetent elderly woman were forcing me to take sophisticated protective measures that demonstrated exactly the opposite. That evening, Lisa called again, this time with information that made my blood run cold. "Grandma Maggie," she said, her voice shaky, "I think Dad is planning something. He's been making a lot of phone calls behind closed doors, and I heard him talking to someone about getting emergency custody or something like that. He mentioned your name several times. Emergency custody." The phrase sent chills down my spine. If David was pursuing emergency legal proceedings, he might be planning to claim that I was in immediate danger and needed to be removed from my home immediately for my own protection. "Lisa, did you hear anything else? Any specific details about what kind of emergency he was claiming?" "Something about you being unsafe living alone, that you might hurt yourself accidentally. He mentioned talking to a judge about temporary guardianship. Grandma, I'm scared. This doesn't seem right." I was scared too, but I tried to keep my voice calm for Lisa's sake. "Sweetheart, thank you for telling me this. It helps me know what to prepare for. I want you to know that whatever your father does next, I'm going to be fine. I have good lawyers and doctors who know the truth about my situation. Is there anything I can do? Actually, yes. If your father asks you to sign any papers or make any statements about my behavior or mental state, please don't do it. And if possible, try to remember exactly what he says during these phone calls. It might be important later." After Lisa hung up, I immediately called Michael Rodriguez's emergency number. When he answered, I could hear the tension in his voice before I even spoke. "Mrs. Thompson, I was just about to call you. I've received word that an emergency guardianship petition has been filed in Riverside County Court. David is claiming that you're in immediate danger due to severe cognitive decline, and that emergency intervention is necessary to protect you from harm." My worst fears were being realized. What does this mean? What happens next? "There will be an emergency hearing probably within 48 hours. David will present whatever evidence he's fabricated to support his claims. The judge will review the petition and determine whether temporary guardianship is warranted while a full investigation is conducted." I felt my world tilting. Could I actually be removed from my home based on David's lies? In theory, yes. Emergency guardianship proceedings are designed to protect people who are genuinely in immediate danger. Judges take these petitions seriously because the consequences of ignoring legitimate concerns could be catastrophic. However, the standard is supposed to be very high, requiring clear and convincing evidence of immediate risk. Michael's tone became more reassuring. But Mrs. Thompson, we're prepared for this. We have Dr. Kim's cognitive evaluation, Dr. Martinez's statements, the Adult Protective Services report clearing you, documentation of David's lies and fraud attempts, and evidence of his criminal behavior. No reasonable judge will grant emergency guardianship when presented with this evidence. What do I need to do? Be at my office tomorrow morning at 8. We'll review all our documentation, prepare your testimony, and make sure you're ready for whatever David presents in court. And Mrs. Thompson, try not to worry too much. David has overplayed his hand. This emergency petition will likely be the action that finally exposes his scheme, publicly and permanently. I spent that night organizing every piece of documentation I'd gathered over the past weeks. Bank statements showing my competent financial management, medical records confirming my good health, witness statements from friends and neighbors attesting to my independence, recordings of David's lies and manipulations. By morning, I had assembled a comprehensive portfolio that told the true story of a competent woman being systematically attacked by her own son. The security system installation team arrived at 7 in the morning, working efficiently to place cameras and sensors throughout my property. As they worked, I received a call from Dr. Martinez with unexpected news. Maggie, I've been contacted by an attorney representing your son. They're requesting copies of all your medical records for the past 5 years, claiming they need them for emergency guardianship proceedings. I wanted you to know before I respond to their request. This was David's next escalation. Having failed to find evidence in my garbage, he was now trying to access my private medical records, probably hoping to find something he could misinterpret or take out of context. Sarah, what are you going to tell them? Exactly what I'm required to tell them under HIPAA regulations. That I cannot release any patient medical information without explicit written consent from the patient or a valid court order. If they want your records for these proceedings, they'll need to follow proper legal procedures. Dr. Martinez paused before continuing. Maggie, I've also been contacted by someone from the Ohio State Medical Board. Apparently, David filed a complaint claiming that I've been negligent in treating your supposed cognitive decline. He's alleging that I failed to diagnose or report your mental health issues, putting you and others at risk. The scope of David's attacks was breathtaking. Not content with trying to destroy my reputation and independence, he was now attempting to damage the career of my longtime physician and friend. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never intended for my family problems to affect your practice. Don't apologize, Maggie. This kind of retaliatory complaint is more common than you might think in cases involving family disputes over guardianship. The medical board has seen this before, and they have procedures for handling obviously frivolous complaints. David's allegations will be quickly dismissed once they review the actual evidence. At Michael Rodriguez's office, we spent 3 hours preparing for the emergency hearing. Michael had assembled an impressive array of documentation and expert testimony that would be available if needed. Mrs. Thompson, he said as we reviewed our strategy, I want you to understand what's likely to happen in court today. David's attorney will present their petition first, outlining their claims about your alleged incompetence and immediate danger. They'll probably present selected evidence taken out of context, possibly including false witness statements or misrepresented medical information. I nodded, feeling surprisingly calm despite the gravity of the situation. When it's our turn, Michael continued, we'll systematically dismantle every claim they've made. We'll present Dr. Kim's cognitive evaluation, the APS report clearing you, evidence of David's lies and fraud, and testimony about his criminal behavior. By the end of our presentation, it will be clear that this petition is not about protecting you, but about David attempting to steal your assets through legal manipulation. The Riverside County Courthouse was an imposing brick building that had served the community for over a century. As we walked through its corridors toward Judge Helen Morrison's courtroom, I felt the weight of history and law that surrounded us. Somewhere in this building, Decades of family disputes had been resolved, justice had been served, and truth had prevailed over deception. Judge Morrison was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had a reputation for being fair but demanding, patient with legitimate concerns, but intolerant of frivolous litigation or manipulation of the court system. David sat at the opposing table with his attorney, a man I didn't recognize who looked like he specialized in quick legal maneuvers rather than careful preparation. David avoided making eye contact with me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept adjusting his tie and checking his watch. "This court is now in session," Judge Morrison announced. "We are here for an emergency guardianship petition filed by David Thompson regarding his mother, Margaret Thompson. Counsel for the petitioner, please present your case." David's attorney stood and launched into a presentation that was both familiar and shocking. He painted a picture of an elderly woman in severe cognitive decline, living alone and making increasingly dangerous decisions. He claimed I had been found wandering confused in my neighborhood, that I had been making erratic financial decisions, that multiple healthcare providers had expressed concerns about my mental state. "Your Honor," the attorney continued, "Mrs. Thompson's son has tried repeatedly to address these concerns through family intervention, but she has become paranoid and hostile, refusing help and accusing family members of trying to harm her. This pattern of paranoid delusions, combined with her declining cognitive function, creates an immediate danger that requires emergency intervention." He presented what appeared to be witness statements from neighbors claiming to have observed concerning behavior, medical records supposedly documenting cognitive decline, and financial documents allegedly showing poor decision-making. The presentation was slick and professional, exactly the kind of case that might convince a judge who didn't have access to the full truth. When David's attorney finished, Judge Morrison turned to Michael Rodriguez. "Counsel for the respondent, please present your case." Michael stood with the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. "Your Honor, what we have just witnessed is not a legitimate petition to protect a vulnerable adult, but rather a calculated attempt to defraud Mrs. Thompson of her assets and independence through systematic legal manipulation." He began with Dr. Kim's cognitive evaluation, reading aloud her conclusion that I demonstrated exceptional mental clarity and cognitive function for someone of any age. He presented the Adult Protective Services report that had found no evidence of neglect or incompetence. He played selected portions of my recordings, documenting David's lies and manipulations. "Your Honor," Michael continued, "the petitioner has systematically lied to healthcare providers, financial institutions, and government agencies about Mrs. Thompson's mental state. He has forged legal documents, made false reports to Adult Protective Services, and engaged in criminal trespassing on Mrs. Thompson's property." Michael presented the forged power of attorney document, the documentation of David's unauthorized financial inquiries, and the police report about the garbage search. Each piece of evidence systematically dismantled the narrative David had tried to construct. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that the petitioner himself is under investigation for insurance fraud involving elderly clients. This petition appears to be motivated not by genuine concern for Mrs. Thompson's welfare, but by the petitioner's own desperate financial circumstances." Judge Morrison's expression had grown increasingly stern as Michael presented the evidence. When he finished, she looked directly at David's attorney. "Counselor, do you have any response to the allegations that your client has systematically fabricated evidence and lied to multiple institutions?" David's attorney stammered through a weak response about family concerns and misunderstandings, but it was clear that he had been caught completely off guard by the extent of evidence against his client's claims. Judge Morrison then addressed me directly. "Mrs. Thompson, please approach the bench." I stood and walked forward, my mind clear and my voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Morrison said, "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both sides. Based on the cognitive evaluation, the professional assessments, and the documented evidence of fraud and manipulation, I find no credible evidence supporting claims of your mental incompetence or immediate danger." Relief flooded through me, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice taking on a steely edge, "this court takes a very dim view of attempts to manipulate the guardianship system for personal financial gain. Mr. Thompson's petition appears to be based entirely on fabricated evidence and fraudulent claims. She turned toward David and his attorney. This petition is denied in its entirety. Moreover, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges, including elder abuse, fraud, and perjury. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. David's face had gone completely white, and his attorney was already gathering papers with the urgency of someone who wanted to distance himself from a sinking ship. As we left the courtroom, Michael Rodriguez was practically glowing with satisfaction. "Mrs. Thompson, that was one of the most complete vindications I've ever seen in a guardianship case. David's scheme hasn't just failed, it's backfired spectacularly." But even as relief washed over me, I knew this wasn't truly over. David was now facing potential criminal charges, professional ruin, and the complete collapse of his relationship with his family. Desperate people often make desperate choices, and I needed to be prepared for whatever final moves he might attempt. That evening, as I sat in my secure home surrounded by the protection of cameras and alarms, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. I had gone from being the target of an elaborate fraud scheme to being the architect of its complete exposure and failure. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Lisa, calling from her college dorm room. "Grandma Maggie," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "Mom just told me what happened in court today. I can't believe Dad did all those things. I'm so sorry I believed him when he said you were sick." "Lisa, sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. Your father is very persuasive, and you had no reason to doubt him. The important thing is that the truth has come out." What's going to happen to Dad now? It was a question I'd been struggling with myself. I don't know, Lisa. That will depend on the authorities and the choices your father makes going forward. But I want you to know that whatever happens, you will always have a place in my life. This conflict is between your father and me, not between you and me. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite chair to read. The house felt peaceful and secure, protected by technology and law, surrounded by the support of friends and professionals who had stood by me when I needed them most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the criminal investigation proceeded, and David faced the consequences of his choices. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt completely safe in my own home, confident in my independence, and vindicated in my decision to fight back against his manipulations. The scared elderly woman David had tried to portray had never existed. The competent, strategic, well-prepared woman who had defeated his scheme was who I had always been. David had simply been too arrogant and too desperate to recognize that truth until it was far too late. The criminal investigation moved swiftly once Judge Morrison referred David's case to the district attorney's office. Detective Robert Chen, a specialist in financial crimes against the elderly, contacted me within days of the court hearing to schedule a comprehensive interview about David's activities. Detective Chen was a methodical professional who understood the complexity of family-based financial exploitation cases. He spent 3 hours at my dining room table, reviewing every piece of evidence I'd collected and asking detailed questions about the timeline of David's deception. "Mrs. Thompson," he said as he organized the documents into evidence folders, "this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of elder abuse I've encountered. Your foresight in recording conversations and gathering witness statements has made our job significantly easier." I poured him another cup of coffee, feeling a sense of satisfaction at seeing my careful preparation validated by law enforcement. "Detective Chen, what kind of charges is David likely to face?" "Multiple felonies," he replied without hesitation. "Financial exploitation of an elderly person, identity theft for the forged power of attorney, filing false reports with government agencies, perjury for his court testimony, and possibly conspiracy if we determine that his wife knowingly participated in the scheme." The mention of Becca surprised me. "Do you believe Rebecca was actively involved?" Detective Chen consulted his notes. "She was present during several key conversations where false claims were made about your mental state. She participated in discussions about gaining control of your finances. Whether she was a willing participant or simply following her husband's lead will require further investigation." Over the following weeks, the scope of David's legal troubles expanded beyond even my case. The insurance fraud investigation that Michael Rodriguez had mentioned earlier culminated in additional criminal charges. Detective Sarah Walsh from the State Insurance Commission explained the details when she interviewed me as part of their investigation. Your son's insurance business was operating what amounted to a sophisticated fraud scheme targeting elderly clients, Detective Walsh explained. He was selling unnecessary policies to seniors with cognitive impairment, forging signatures on applications, and collecting commissions on policies that provided no actual benefit to the purchasers. The parallels to his behavior toward me were striking and disturbing. How many victims were there? At least 37 that we've identified so far, with total fraudulent sales exceeding $400,000. The method was remarkably similar to what he attempted with you, convincing elderly people that they needed protection they didn't actually need, then taking financial advantage of their supposed vulnerability. Detective Walsh's investigation revealed that David's financial desperation stemmed from mounting legal fees and potential restitution payments related to the insurance fraud. My nest egg hadn't been just an opportunistic target. It had been his planned salvation from professional and legal ruin. The Insurance Commission's findings explained why David's approach to gaining control of my finances had been so systematic and sophisticated. He had been practicing variations of the same manipulation tactics on his elderly clients for months, perfecting techniques for convincing people they needed financial protection they didn't actually require. 3 months after the court hearing, David's criminal trial began. I testified as the primary victim in the elder abuse case, walking the jury through each element of his deception with the same methodical precision I'd once used to present budget proposals to school boards. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Maria Gonzalez, presented a devastating case that combined my documentation with evidence from the insurance fraud investigation. The jury heard recordings of David's lies, saw the forged power of attorney, reviewed witness statements documenting his false claims to multiple institutions, and listened to testimony from his insurance fraud victims. David's defense attorney attempted to portray his actions as misguided but well-intentioned concern for an aging mother. But this narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence, showing his systematic and calculated approach to financial exploitation. Becca testified as part of a plea agreement, admitting that she had known David was lying about my mental state but had gone along with his scheme because of their desperate financial situation. Her testimony was particularly damaging because it confirmed that David's claims about my supposed dementia were entirely fabricated, rather than based on any genuine concerns. David told me that his mother was too proud to accept help, even though she needed it, Becca testified, tears streaming down her face. He said the only way to protect her finances was to convince authorities that she wasn't capable of managing them herself. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared about losing our house, about what would happen to our family if David went to prison for the insurance fraud. Lisa attended the trial, sitting in the gallery with her aunt and cousin. I had encouraged her to maintain whatever relationship she could with her father, but I also wanted her to understand the full truth about what he had done. At 19, she was old enough to comprehend the gravity of his choices and the consequences they would bring. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts related to my case. When Judge Morrison sentenced David to 8 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, I felt no satisfaction or vindictive pleasure. Instead, I felt a deep sadness for the son I had raised, who had chosen deception and greed over honesty and family loyalty. The insurance fraud conviction brought an additional 12-year sentence, to be served concurrently with the elder abuse conviction. David would likely spend the next decade in prison, his professional licenses permanently revoked, his reputation permanently destroyed. As the months passed and life returned to something approaching normal, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications of what had happened. David's scheme had been enabled by societal assumptions about aging and competence, by institutions that were too willing to believe that elderly people were inherently vulnerable and confused. The bank employees who had listened to David's concerns about my financial decisions, the home health agency that had scheduled an assessment based solely on his request, even the Adult Protective Services worker, who had initiated an investigation based on his false report, had all operated under assumptions that my age made his claims plausible. I decided to channel this insight into advocacy work that would honor the struggle I'd endured, while potentially helping other seniors facing similar exploitation. I began volunteering with the Riverside County Elder Rights Project, sharing my story with other seniors and training bank employees, healthcare workers, and social service providers to recognize the warning signs of family-based financial abuse. Dr. Martinez and I collaborated on presentations to medical professionals about the importance of direct patient communication, rather than relying on family member reports about elderly patients' mental state. Our presentation, titled "When Family Members Lie: Recognizing Fabricated Concerns About Elder Competence," became a popular continuing education program throughout Ohio. The security system I'd installed during the crisis proved useful for reasons I hadn't anticipated. The cameras that had been intended to protect me from David's intrusions now provided peace of mind for Lisa and other family members who worried about my safety living alone. Rather than evidence of vulnerability, the security measures became proof of my proactive approach to maintaining independence. Lisa completed her sophomore year at Ohio State, with grades that reflected her resilience in dealing with family trauma. She spent that summer living with me, helping to repair relationships that had been damaged by David's deceptions, and learning about the financial management skills that would serve her well in adulthood. "Grandma Maggie," she said one evening as we worked together in my garden, "I've been thinking about changing my major to social work or maybe law. What happened to you and what Dad did to all those other elderly people, it made me realize how many people need protection from this kind of abuse." I felt a surge of pride in the young woman Lisa was becoming, shaped by adversity into someone committed to protecting others rather than exploiting them. "Whatever you choose to study, sweetheart, I think you'll make a real difference in people's lives." The financial impact of David's schemes ultimately proved minimal thanks to my preparation and quick action. My assets remained secure, my independence intact, and my reputation in the community actually enhanced by the way I had handled the crisis. The legal fees for defending myself and pursuing criminal charges were substantial, but they represented a worthwhile investment in preventing future victimization. More importantly, the documentation I had gathered and the professional relationships I had maintained provided a template for other seniors facing similar exploitation. Michael Rodriguez and I co-authored an article for the Ohio Bar Association's Elder Law Journal titled "Building the Perfect Defense: How Systematic Documentation Can Defeat Family-Based Financial Exploitation." Janet Walsh's husband Tom used his police connections to establish an informal network of retired law enforcement officers who volunteered to provide security assessments and safety planning for elderly community members facing family conflicts. The Senior Shield program now operates in 6 counties across Ohio, offering practical protection services that help elderly people maintain independence while staying safe. Dr. Kim expanded her cognitive assessment practice to include preventative evaluations for seniors concerned about family members questioning their mental capacity. Her competency documentation service provides official validation of mental acuity that can be used to counter false claims before they escalate to legal proceedings. 18 months after David's conviction, I received an unexpected letter from him in prison. Written on standard institutional stationery, it contained what appeared to be a genuine apology and acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. "Mom," the letter began, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. The counseling programs here have helped me see that what I did to you wasn't just theft. It was betrayal of everything you taught me about honesty and treating people with respect." He wrote about the shame he felt for traumatizing Lisa with lies about my health, for attempting to destroy my independence and reputation, for putting his own financial problems ahead of my well-being and dignity. The letter seemed sincere, but I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. "I don't expect you to want a relationship with me when I get out," the letter continued, "but I hope someday you might be able to forgive me, not for my sake but for your own peace of mind. You deserved so much better from the son you raised and supported for so many years." I showed the letter to Lisa during one of her weekend visits. She read it silently, then set it down on my kitchen table with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think he really means it, Grandma?" I considered the question carefully. "I think prison and counseling may have helped your father understand the impact of his choices in a way he didn't before. Whether that understanding represents genuine change or just regret about getting caught, I honestly don't know." Are you going to write back to him? Not yet, I said. Maybe someday, but I'm not ready for that conversation. Right now, I'm focused on moving forward rather than looking backward. Lisa nodded, understanding the complexity of forgiveness when betrayal runs so deep. I think I want to visit him eventually, but I'm not ready either. It's hard to reconcile the father I thought I knew with the person who did all those things to you. 2 years after the trial, my life had found a new equilibrium that was in many ways better than what had existed before David's betrayal. The crisis had forced me to build stronger relationships with friends, develop new advocacy interests, and create security systems that enhanced rather than restricted my independence. The house that David had tried to steal through legal manipulation had become a gathering place for family and friends who appreciated my hospitality and respected my autonomy. Lisa brought college friends home for holidays, introducing them to her grandmother, who had defeated her own son's attempt to declare her incompetent. My financial portfolio, protected from David's schemes through careful preparation and quick action, continued to grow under Elizabeth Hartwell's management. The money that David had tried to access to solve his own problems now funded scholarships for students studying elder law and advocacy, ensuring that future seniors would have better protection against financial exploitation. The recordings that had provided crucial evidence in David's prosecution were eventually donated to the Ohio Attorney General's office for use in training programs for law enforcement officers and social service workers. My voice, captured defending my competence and independence against my own son's lies, now helps train professionals to recognize and respond to similar cases of family-based abuse. On a warm spring morning, 3 years after the crisis began, I stood in my kitchen making coffee and planning my day. I had a board meeting for the Elder Rights Project, lunch with Dr. Martinez to discuss our latest presentation, and dinner with Lisa, who was graduating from law school the following month with a specialization in elder law. The phone rang, and caller ID showed it was Janet Walsh. "Maggie," she said when I answered. "Tom just heard through his police contacts that David is coming up for parole review next year. They wanted to give you advance notice in case you want to provide victim impact testimony." I thanked Janet for the information while considering what my response might be. David had served 4 years of his sentence, and prison counseling programs seemed to have had some positive impact based on his letters and Lisa's occasional reports from visits. The question of whether he deserved early release wasn't mine to answer alone. The parole board would consider his behavior in prison, the likelihood of reoffending, and the impact on his victims. What I could control was whether to participate in that process, and what I might say if given the opportunity. That evening, as I worked in my garden while the security cameras recorded the peaceful scene, I reflected on how profoundly my life had been changed by David's attempt to destroy it. His betrayal had forced me to become a more strategic, more prepared, and more connected person than I had been before. The quiet competence that had served me well as an educator and financial manager had evolved into something more powerful. The proven ability to defend myself against sophisticated manipulation, to build coalitions of professional support, and to turn a position of apparent vulnerability into one of strength. David had seen an elderly widow living alone and assumed she would be an easy target for financial exploitation. What he had discovered, too late to save himself, was that he had chosen to attack someone with the intelligence to see through his deception, the patience to document his crimes, the resources to fight back effectively, and the determination to see justice done. As the sun set over Riverside, casting long shadows across my secure and comfortable home, I felt deeply grateful for the outcome of a crisis that could have destroyed everything I had worked to build. Instead of losing my independence and assets to my son's greed, I had proven my competence beyond any doubt and built a legacy of advocacy that would protect other seniors facing similar threats. The scared, confused, elderly woman that David had tried to portray to courts and community had never existed, except in his desperate imagination. The strong, intelligent, well-prepared woman who had defeated his scheme was who I had always been, and who I would continue to be for whatever challenges lay ahead. My mind was clear, my independence secure, and my future bright with possibilities that David's narrow vision of elderly vulnerability had never been able to comprehend. The son who had tried to convince everyone I had dementia had learned the hardest way possible just how sharp my mind really was. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.